Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam. Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's a great pleasure to be back in the Bowles Mill Community Centre, to be back in Nottingham after a long time. And I found it very nostalgic to be on the way on the tram, going through the city and just seeing just different roads, different places where things had happened to me that had slipped from my memory. To see the place brings back the memory and the emotions, and also to see faces that I haven't seen for a long time also brings back a lot of emotions. So it's been a very nice day for me. My time in Nottingham was a very important part of my life and very formative to what I'm doing now. And this is why I absolutely had to accept the gracious invitation to come and present something today. I am presenting on an overview of Contemporary Quranic Studies. I have been, as Dr. Sab has been mentioned, researching in the Quran for about a decade now, and I've also more recently branched into some theological research as well, but I'm still involved in Quranic studies, and I teach mainly Quranic studies. And so this comes out of teaching as well. And I'll mention some of those things in the lecture. And it will be an academic presentation. I will try to, obviously make it accessible and interesting, but that is what we're doing. It's not a dars. I'm not kind of, going to explain the Quran to you. I'm going to be talking about contemporary studies on the Quran and how people are approaching the Quran. And I think that's important too. So hopefully this will be useful. So I'll start. So what is Quranic studies? What is Quranic studies? This may seem self-explanatory. Surely it's the study of the Quran, the supreme scripture of Islam, revealed to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and believed by Muslims to be God's speech. But Quranic studies, as I am taking it, as I want to speak today, is not the same as, or exactly the same as Ulum al-Quran. Ulum al-Quran is the Quranic disciplines, which is the traditional Arabic genre of Muslim reflection and inquiry into the text, so that scholars would write books and study in the madrasa a subject called Ulum al-Quran. But Quranic studies is not quite the same as that, and I want to explain why that is. But first, Ulum al-Quran, this is not just a matter of translation. Ulum al-Quran can be taught in English. Ulum al-Quran can increasingly be taught with English translations of classical books. You can go to a dars or a class and study Ulum al-Quran in English with English books and get some benefit. And of course, the objective often is to learn Arabic and to be able to access the Arabic classics for that subject. But Quranic studies is something a little bit different, and I want to sort of approach what that is. It's not also necessarily something that is done in English or in the West, Quranic studies. But it is something that is, I would say, modern. It's something that is done in the modern space of education. It's a field of academic studies. And it typically takes place within the university or another higher education institute. To some more traditionally minded Muslims, the university is the opposite of all authentic knowledge, right? To some, and for Islamic studies, I'm not looking at the wider, but to some, the university is everything that is wrong with knowledge. Everything that is the opposite of knowledge. Everything that represents a break with the transmission of knowledge from generation to generation. To study the Quran in a university, therefore, is no more than a foolish attempt to bind the sacred within the confines of the profane, to take something sacred and put it in a place where it cannot be meaningfully approached at all. On the other hand, you also have a very strong view from non-Muslim academics who see the secular university as the laboratory in which the Quran can be truly given the scientific criticism that the Muslims have not given it. And to to use the tools of modern historical and textual study to reveal, as they think and they argue, the process of its exclusively human origin. So you get these two. What I'm trying to present here is that there's two opposing camps. There are the traditional-minded Muslims who will not even enter into a university or see anything of value to come from a university, and you have, what we can call Orientalists in the old sense, who see the university as the perfect place to reveal the truth behind the Quran that only they can reveal with modern knowledge. And what I obviously want to do here is to say there is a middle way, there is a middle ground. There is a way that faithful Muslims can profitably and beneficially study in the university. Obviously, someone who's done a PhD and working as a lecturer will say that. And also that there is a way that non-Muslims too can engage in a way that's not that doesn't we could say disrespect the importance and the status that the Quran should be given, even if someone doesn't accept it as their scripture. There is a certain status and weight that the Quran should be given as a great scripture, whether or not someone believes that it is the message from God. So I want to give this middle view and show some of the possibilities there. You do get, of course, Muslims who are not committed to the secular project, but will still bracket their convictions in engaging in the Quran. And this is quite common in the university, that you will find Muslims working according to the methodology of people who do not accept the Quran as God's word. They sort of bracket or leave out their confessional commitments to one side and just still approach with the same historical methodologies of their non-Muslim colleagues. I want to try to show a different route, and it's a route that I myself have taken in some of my work. I want to show that there is a way to conceive of contemporary Quranic studies which acknowledges the research contributions of a wide range of confessional positions, of theoretical positions, of methodological approaches, and that every scholar and student alike has to stand somewhere. Every student of the Quran, every scholar of the Quran always stands with some position and some stance and some confessional outlook or other. Knowledge of any kind cannot be approached in the abstract. Knowledge is only gained within the life and the life worlds of human beings who sit within classrooms, human beings who visit libraries, build their own libraries in their house or of their PDF collection in the cloud, or go and discuss with colleagues in person or through the internet, drink coffee and tea with friends, go home and spend time with their family and so on. Every scholar lives a life, and you cannot separate that from their scholarship. And the same for the student who is seeking to learn more. The idea that at some point in history or at some point today, the scholar enters into a vacuum of pure objectivity in which they float with texts without any human life involved is a myth. It's not possible. Everyone is rooted within a social landscape, a linguistic landscape, an intellectual context. These factors that surround us influence what we think. And they influence what we can think, what we're able to conceive of. And at the same time, everyone has a degree of freedom, a degree of agency, ability to change their conditions and adjust their preconceptions and to learn something new. And often this happens in the light of experiences. It's only with our experiences, with the lessons that life teaches us, that we see new perspectives. And certainly I can say that's true for myself, that in the time, certain things that I think now I couldn't have thought 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And I'm sure that in 10, 20 years' time, we'll all be able to conceive of new things as well. And this is a healthy sign that we are growing and learning. So, on this basis, scholars of Quranic studies stand within different traditions. They work from different traditions. There are always going to be a plurality of approaches. We should expect this. Both with Muslim scholars, as we know, are not all of one school of thought. They're not all going to agree on every principle and every method. and likewise for non-Muslim scholars as well. In many cases today in Quranic studies, we get this, and you probably haven't, necessarily heard this, but for those who work in the field, in Western literature, there's often the idea of a crisis. That Quranic studies is in crisis. Why? Because there's no agreed method. But I think this idea of crisis, and this has been pointed out by other scholars, is really a reaction to the changing landscape. That it's no longer possible to have a single viewpoint, a single Orientalism that can look at the Quran in one way and find an agreement. You're going to have this diversity. We're in a what's called a postmodern landscape, in which people from all different perspectives are vying to make their viewpoint the dominant one. And there's a lot more acceptance these days of the acknowledgement of one's commitments. 50 years, maybe 100 years ago, a scholar would not necessarily want to put down their own personal faith commitments into their work. It would be a separate thing that someone would want to be scientific, and to be scientific means one does not put one's own faith or confessional commitments down. That's really dropped away to a large extent, and some have tried to keep it going. It's also a world today that increasingly challenges the assumption of male dominance of knowledge and male dominance of knowledge production. Like other traditions, the record of pre-modern Muslim scholarship on the Quran does not live up to the claims that the religion makes as a whole, that the pursuit of knowledge is for male and female alike. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the classical tafsir, this is the defining work of a scholar. That a scholar would often write their tafsir at the end of their life, and it would be the sum total of their knowledge poured into their final work, which is their tafsir. But to my knowledge, we have no example of a pre-modern tafsir authored by a woman. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope that one day we will find something to show that a female scholar in the classical period of Islam wrote a full tafsir. But to my knowledge, we don't have that. And this is a sign that in the modern period, despite the problems of the modern period, one of the things that has emerged is genuine female scholarship on the Quran. You can give examples such as the Egyptian professor Aisha Abdurrahman or Bint Shati, who died in 1998, as well as Western scholars. And some of the Western scholars have focused specifically on trying to redress what they feel has been wrong, has been done wrong in the past, and they have taken a so-called feminist paradigm. And there's criticisms of this, and there's valid criticisms. I think a good summary of this is in the work by Aisha Hidayatullah in her book Feminist Edges of the Quran. She summarizes the methods. She also puts forward the shortcomings and the possible future trajectory of this particular movement. So today you have a much more diverse field, and you have female tafsir, you have different perspectives within that. And it's a good thing, I think, that in the academic world, you do have a range of scholars producing different work on the Quran, male and female, and they present at conferences and publish in journals and in books. Furthermore, Quranic studies continues to grow around the world, and the automatic links between one's scholarly position and one's belief have become eroded. What I mean by this, as I already said, is that you have Muslims who may believe in Islam, but they still work as if they were a non-Muslim historian. On the other hand, you have non-Muslim scholars who seek to understand the Quran with this acute sensitivity to the canons of Muslim tradition, to exactly how Muslims would appreciate it. And really, when you read their work, it's as if you're reading the work of a Muslim. And I'll point out a good example is the Australian academic Anthony Johns. In an interview, he comments about how he conducted his work, and he says, he conducts his work in the sense of exploring a spiritual tradition on what people in a different culture, a different world, but a parallel world in many ways to so-called Europe and so-called, I suppose, orthodoxy, that is to say, Orthodox Christianity and so on, explored and expanded and responded to their traditions. So Johns is showing, he is a Catholic, but he shows this sensitivity. When you read his work, you really get an appreciation of the Quranic discourse, the Quranic narratives, in a way as if he was a Muslim. And you really would, hearing his presentation, you do not know. And on the interview, I had to ask him, are you a Muslim? And he said, no, I'm a Catholic. But his perspective is like this. So I think this shows that, of course, ultimately one's beliefs will have a big impact. It is possible to to enter into engagement with the Quran in a way with the utmost of respect, even if coming from a different faith tradition. I'm also aware that the blind spots of scholarship in Quranic studies is also tied to the questions of power and politics, the historical legacy of Western colonialism and Muslim responses to it. In recent years, some steps have been taken to begin to tackle these issues head on and present ideas of how the field can move forward. And what I mean by this is that some scholars today are arguing that Quranic studies as a field needs to be decolonized because, to a large extent up until now, it's really privileged so-called Euro-American knowledge production ahead of the Muslim traditions, such that Muslim work that comes from a Muslim epistemic space, Muslim knowledge, we could say. For example, using the traditional tafsir to explain the text. This has been deprivileged to the extent that it's not considered real knowledge. If a Muslim scholar writes a book, perhaps the book is not even reviewed. It's not that it's disagreed with, it's not even given the status of genuine knowledge. It's just belief. And what I am hopeful about is increasingly we are seeing that these different ways of seeing the Quran, different techniques and methods, including those coming from the tradition, are given status and a seat at the table, and in fact are becoming vibrant and part of the academic space. And this, I think, is something to be encouraged, and it's a very good thing. So in my teaching, I believe that we have to cast our net wide. We have to engage with the widest scholarship. Whether we come from a more traditional centered background, or whether we come from an academic, or whether someone comes from a non-Muslim perspective, they need to cast their net out to see what's out there and to engage with the full range of other reviews. So what, therefore, should be the common standard of such a diverse and sort of wide-ranging global field? I think that the key principle is what we could call, is basically the principle of peer review. This is the principle which academic study works on. And it's always been the basis of actually, within the Muslim tradition as well, the basis of knowledge and of acceptable teaching and of authority has been through, the granting of ijaza, the granting of idhn or permission, the sense that scholars would validate each other and their knowledge. And in the modern higher education world, the idea here is peer review. That if someone publishes something, a journal or a book, to be acceptable, it has to be checked by other experts. You cannot just publish without getting the views of others, and you have to also take account of the scholarship of others. You can't write in a vacuum on your own. You can't make up your own crackpot theory without any reference to what's been done before. So it's reciprocal. You take into account the work of others, and in turn, others will look at your work and assess it. Whether the Muslim scholar, you may have a Muslim scholar who refuses to look at research produced in the academy, or you may have the academic who only treats work written in European languages as real scholarship. The effect is the same. They may produce useful and insightful works, perhaps directed at a specific audience, but they are to some extent parochial. They're limited in their scope, and this should be recognized. So it's not a problem per se that someone, isn't going to consider everything in their work. There's different types of work done for different audiences, but something cannot claim to be comprehensive if it doesn't take into account the widest possible range of knowledge. And this has always been something that has been recognized in scholarship. There are, of course, boundaries that come from one's language. How many of us, we don't all speak every language in the world. We can't read everything that's been written in every language. And this is fine. There's also things we're not familiar with. There may be things that are outside of our sort of network or our awareness. We can't encompass everything that's written as well, because the rate of scholarly production increases each year. But the point is not to require researchers to achieve the superhuman or to abandon their views or preferred methods, but to point out that everyone's research is enhanced by taking this wider panorama of the common activity of grappling with the Quran. We should also look at the types of institutions in which students can approach Quranic studies in this way. In the West, it is often theological faculties. In the universities, it's the faculty of theology which will be a better place often to do constructive work than the Oriental departments. This has been pointed out recently by Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad in his lecture, his inaugural lecture in London. The other place that he identified is new hybrid institutions that attempt to bridge the gap between traditional Muslim studies and the university. And I'll come on to that in a minute. And there's a question here that is lurking in the background, and I just want to point on this, and I promise we will get to some more kind of sort of practical what is in the field in a minute, but I just want to sort of finish this more theoretical discussion with looking a little bit at the place of the university. What is the function of the university in a society? This is a really important question, and it's one that's often not thought about, really. And one of the people who's thought about it in the best way, in my view, is the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre. Many people have this feeling, especially today, that the university is becoming a place where someone just goes to get a technical qualification for a career. It's become monetarized. It's become a sort of place dictated by the demands of the market. And this has been a big move in recent politics as well. And many scholars, especially in the humanities, are very uncomfortable with this move. The shift of the university from a place that's about knowledge and about social benefit to a place that's about servicing the labour force and the market is a profound shift in our times. And MacIntyre actually also thinks that the university has become stuck in a single vision of knowledge, a single tradition of knowledge, and that really at its best the university should be a place for multiple traditions to be able to interact, that different ways of conceiving things could exist side by side in the university, each one developing its own view of the world and also interacting and dynamically debating with each other. So in this vision you could have a very faith-based Muslim understanding of the Quran that's developed within the university and develops within its own paradigm, within its own perspective, and at the same time is in conversation with other rival views. And it's a different view of the university than we may be used to thinking. And I think that the place of the Muslim colleges is that these are naturally places where that kind of thinking goes on, and it could be a stepping stone to having that wider conversation in the university too. I've spent the greater part now of a decade lecturing on the Quran in various higher education settings. I taught on undergraduate and graduate courses at SOAS, University of London, and then I've spent time teaching at 2 Muslim colleges. My current institutional base is Ibrahim College, which I would characterise as a forward-thinking Muslim seminary with roots in the Deobandi tradition in the busy heart of Whitechapel, East London. And I also have a visiting lecturer role at the Cambridge Muslim College, which is accredited by the Open University for its BA programme. And the Cambridge Muslim College is a Muslim higher education institute that attempts to merge educational values from the Islamic tradition, broadly conceived, with elements, I would say, of the Cambridge college environment. It's a distinctively Cambridge experience to study and teach there, in a way that the kind of urban London Ibrahim College is a very different experience, and I have a very interesting time travelling between both and being involved in conversations in both. But in both places, I have found students that are receptive to approaching Quranic studies in the way that I'm outlining. And these are young, bright students, male and female, who I teach in my lectures, and who, are committed to their religion, but able to look at the Quran in different ways, in different methodologies, to appreciate different perspectives to the text. And I think there's a lot of potential there for the future scholarship of UK, and in fact, many of the students, especially in Cambridge, are actually coming from other places. We have an Australian student, a Polish student, many students coming from other countries as well. Now I'd like to turn to some of the different areas of Quranic studies that I can highlight as important in this contemporary research. I want to put this under three main themes. The first is history, the second is the form of the Quran, and the third is its interpretation. So, when we talk about history, there's a number of things we can highlight. The first I'd like to highlight is what I call the Quranic context. If you want to understand what contemporary Quranic studies is doing, a lot of the time it's discussing the Quran as correctly contextualized in its own historical time period. There's a contextualization to the society today, but what I'm talking about here in historical terms is making sure that we understand the Quran as it was and revealed in its time. So to correctly understand what the Quran is saying, we need to know the society in which it was revealed. I've written a book called The Quran and the Just Society, and the whole discussion there is related to understanding the principles of justice of the Quran within that initial society of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his community for those 23 years. And we need to understand that as a foundation to understanding how to understand the Quran for our time too. Muslim scholarship has always acknowledged the importance of embedding the verses of the Quran within the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, especially through what's called the Asbab al-Nuzul literature, the occasions of revelation. Some in the contemporary period have criticized this literature. Sometimes this is connected with the criticism of hadith in some of the modern studies, but it's also received support. Examples, we have an important figure is the scholar active from the 60s, particularly from the 60s to the 80s, Fazl Rahman Malik, who was at the University of Chicago, and those that have taken on his ideas. And some have criticized his ideas, but others have used his ideas. But he was a key person in the 20th century that emphasized the need to take into account the context of the Quran. While Muslim scholarship has often focused on this internal development, the community and the immediate incidents and situations that occasion the Quran's revelation, some of the contemporary scholarship has focused attention on other aspects of the tradition. For example, important studies have looked at the nature of the period known as the Jahiliya. What is the nature of this pre-Islamic period, often understood as the age of ignorance or the age of hot-headedness. The Muslim tradition presents a mixed picture of what the Arabian society was like before the revelation of the Quran. On the one hand, it's presented as this amoral time of idol worship and of great injustice. On the other hand, we have this image of a heroic time of great ethical virtues, that some of these people had great character, the lineage of the Quraysh of the Prophet's own clan, the Banu Hashim and so on, and of their eloquence in poetry. So we've got these two kind of pictures. And so some recent research has looked at how to resolve this tension, sometimes considering the extent to which later scholars formed the image of how to understand the Jahiliya. Another issue of recent scholarship is the relationship of the Quran and its interpretation to the biblical tradition, to the previous scriptures. A certain strand of so-called Orientalist research, active since the 19th century, has looked at this as borrowing, that the Quran borrows from the Bible, or misappropriates or misunderstands the biblical stories and teachings. But the better recent research has promoted an approach that highlights the Quran's active engagement with the scriptures that came before, and particularly with stories that were already known to its audience, and that the Quran takes stories that the audience have some awareness of, and then in some places corrects, refutes, retells or in other ways engages with that research, with that knowledge of the story. There's also better awareness of the use of biblical materials by the early Muslim commentary tradition in seeking to understand the Quran. That is, that the early Muslims actively would read from the Torah and so on in order to try to understand their stories in the Quran. And likewise, that actually some of these Muslim interpretations had an impact on the developing Jewish commentary on the Torah. So it's not, within the commentary of the two traditions, it's not just a one-way process. There's an interaction between the traditions after the time of the Prophet ﷺ. A second area I'd like to look at quickly is the study of the written text of the Quran, the Mus'haf. Recent discoveries, such as the Sana'a palimpsest in the 1970s, and also rediscoveries based on carbon dating, such as the Birmingham Quran, so-called Birmingham Quran, have as well as research on sort of early Islamic texts, have challenged some of the traditional narratives, or common traditional narratives, amongst Muslims, and also some of the Western skeptical narratives. So, for example, it's now really proven beyond reasonable doubt for the subject of academics, based on arguments, based on karma dating, that the Uthmanic text of the Quran really goes back to the middle of the 7th century, which is exactly the time that Muslims expect it to go back to. On the other hand, we cannot dismiss the existence of other early Mus'haf traditions as mere hearsay. The Mus'haf, for example, the Mus'haf of Ibn Mas'ud enjoyed a widespread popularity in Kufa within the 1st century. And there's other traditions that existed, such as the one represented by the Sana'a manuscript. So the kind of overall picture is that, for sure, the official canonized text produced by Uthman goes back exactly to where the traditional narrative says it has, and it enjoyed a dominant position from the very beginning. But there were other traditions that continued to use for some time some of the other Mus'hafs that were available before that text was put out to all the centers. So there's a more complex picture is being understood. Another issue is the history of the Qira'at. Scholars have looked at the ikhtiyar, the preference of the selection of recitations. How did these readers, the 7 or the 10 recitations, how did these reciters select the readings they were going to recite as their reading, and the methods that they used, and the impact of grammatical considerations, the impact of dialects, different Arabian dialects, and so on. There's been a number of research on this, and there's been a closer understanding of some of these selection procedures and the nature of these, the canonization of these readings. The 7 and 10 that were chosen by Ibn Mujahid in the 4th century were only 7 or 10 out of many readings that existed at the time. And so it's interesting to look at why did he choose these 7 and 10, and what does that say about the history of the text and the history of the recital of the Quran. Excuse me. Not all contemporary researchers focus on questions of history. There's been an important trend to look at more closely at the Quran's overall form. One of the aspects that's important here is to look at the chronology of the surahs. When were the surahs revealed, and what's order? The Muslim traditional scholarship has lists that go back very early, but some scholars have questioned the accuracy of these lists. Do they represent the dominant? Do they represent the truth about this? Can we have a more accurate list? A famous list was composed by a Western scholar called Nöldeke from the middle of the 19th century, and this became a standard part of Western studies of the Quran up until the 20th century, and even to today it's used widely. But recent scholarship has questioned Nöldeke's methodology and has tried to find new ways to understand the Quran. And one of the promising directions here is using kind of modern statistical methods to look at the kind of profile. As we know, Quranic surahs in the Meccan period are very, the verses tend to be very short and sharp, and the length of the verses is generally short. And as it goes to the Medinan period, the verses get longer. So some recent work has looked at trying to see if by checking the average verse length, there are statistical ways to determine the profile of the shift of the Quran. There's been some success that seems to show that this is promising, a promising area. And to be honest, Noldeke was using something like this, but he wasn't as precise as some of recent scholarship. Muslim scholarship has actually managed to show. And if this can be done, it actually could be very useful if we had a clearer idea of within surahs which blocks of text could be put to which exact period. And of course, we also have indications not just from the style, but from the content and from the material and what's discussed in the text. Another area is that's received attention is the structure of the Quranic surah. A major development in 20th century Muslim exegesis is the idea that the surah forms a literary unity, that the surah is one complete has one complete structure. This was actually surprisingly not common in the classical tafsir tradition. The classical tafsir tradition tended to look at each verse individually, and even each part of a verse individually as a separate issue. And in some cases, some figures, such as Fakhruddin al-Razi, would look at the link between various verses. But the idea to look at the sort of organic unity of a single surah was not the dominant way, or even a major way of looking at the surah. This has all changed in the 20th century. A number of Muslim scholars started to use this approach, and independently from each other. One of the most notable is the Indian scholar Al-Farahi, and others have, and his student Islahi, and others as well. And what researchers have begun to highlight is distinctive parallel, mirror, and ring structures within the Quran. So you have a certain set of meanings, and then you have again that repeated, say, three meanings, then a repeated three section, or you have mirror, so you have something and then in reverse, or you have something, it's reverse, and in the middle something different, which is a kind of ring, a concentric idea. So in all these cases, there seems to be a increasing effort to look at the Quran and look at the surahs as formed with a definite structure, and to see what that points out in terms of the meanings of the surahs. But a recurring worry has been that researchers are starting to subjectively read these elements into the text. They're starting to find these structures and interpret the Quran in order to suit these structures. This would make these theories more of a tafsir or exegetical technique than a study of the Quranic form. So there's an ongoing debate about how to determine whether the Quran has these structures, but it's certainly a live area of research. Finally, in form, you also have increasing discussion of the narratives of the Quran, the way that the Quran uses the narratives of the prophets to embed the Quranic message, the difference and connection to the narratives of the Bible. For example, several scholars have studied the comparison between the Surah Yusuf, which is the longest continuous story in the Quran, comparing it to the biblical story of Joseph, and looking at the differences. One of the people that has done this is Abdul Halim, and he emphasizes the Quranic use of ellipsis. The Quran doesn't give every detail, but just fades between scenes, and highlights the stylistic qualities of this, and how it affects the kind of stylistic effect of that. And in fact, another scholar has also in the Western tradition has also looked at this, and even concludes that the Quranic story of Yusuf, despite being shorter with less details, is actually more nuanced and complex in its form and in its message. So there's a lot of interesting research going on in different ways of the different Quranic stories, and also, of course, when you have multiple use of the stories of the prophets in different surahs, each one tied to the particular meanings of that surah, but cumulatively echoing and adding different meanings to each other, and so you get this very interesting picture of each prophet that's mentioned in the Quran, from considering all the different places in which that prophet is mentioned. Also you have a focus in contemporary work on the discipline of balagha, and appreciation of balagha has become an important aspect of the study. Again here, Professor Abdul Halim of SOAS has been an important voice in demonstrating that Western scholars in the earlier period did not translate and take into account key texts of balagha, and thus missed out on certain insights that were already known to Muslim scholarship. And here is an example of where, by deprivileging the field of balagha, Western scholars for a while really deprived themselves of knowledge that would have helped them do a better job of appreciating the Quran. And now certain scholars are calling for more work on balagha as a field. And so, for example, Professor Abdul Halim, one of his key works was an article on iltifat, which is the shifting of address. Like in the Quran, Allah will write in the third. He'll speak about himself in the third person, and then he'll suddenly speak in the first person. And when this shift happens, it isn't just at random. Of course, it's stylistically appropriate. And the studies of balagha understood this and studied this, and by understanding this, we can better understand the Quranic message and what the Quran is doing stylistically. The final area that I'm going to look at is the interpretation of the Quran. There are a number of areas that have become important here. One is, the idea of interpretation of the Quran. How much can we take from contemporary Western works on literary criticism, and treating the Quran as literature? Some scholars have taken this approach. Others have tried to incorporate more of the ideas from the Muslim tradition. Myself, I've taken ideas from disciplines of ulum al-Quran and usul al-fiqh and others in order to try to understand the Quran in a distinct way. A second area of importance and very dear to the heart of Dr. Musharraf, of course, is translation of the Quran. We are now at the stage where a translation of the Quran into English is published every year, right? Doesn't mean they're all good and valuable, but they are published every year. So there is a question of what does a translation offer that is distinctive to the reader? Many academics have published a translation of the Quran that just sits on the bookshelf of a few libraries and is never read. There are different strategies, of course, that can be pursued in translation and different effects. And there's no one correct translation, of course. There are different ways to translate, and there always will be, and really to serve different audiences and purposes. So as Dr. Musharraf has focused on a plain English translation, which is very much has got an effort of reaching a widest possible audience in contemporary Britain, and to give clarify moral guidance and clarify the key points and themes with subheadings and so on. Others have taken have tried to, for example, express some of the eloquence of the Quranic language. So Shawkat Turawa has produced certain surahs in a rhyming prose, such as Surah Ar-Rahman in rhymed cadenced prose, which of course has a very different effect and is for maybe a more specialized audience, and it may not apply so well, for example, to Medinan surahs, where the rhyme is less regular, it's much less frequent, is what I mean. So the important thing, of course, with translation is about considering the benefits to the reader of the choices made, and to try to be consistent in the approach. The study of Tafseer has been growing into its own subfield, where before it was part of just Quranic studies. Now Tafseer Studies is its own field. The main figure here, one of the main figures here, is Walid Saleh, and one of his main insights is to demonstrate that the real division in tafsir is not between so-called rational and traditional types of tafsir, but between the large encyclopedic tafsirs such as Razi, which are used for reference, and the so-called madrasa tafsirs that were used for teaching, such as Baydawi. So he's kind of tried to reconfigure the way that we see the field of tafsir. Something that's close to my heart is Quranic ethics. And there's been a definite ethical term in recent studies of the Quran, the focus on the ethics of the Quran and the importance of that aspect. Of course, here we have figures such as Fazl Rahman, already mentioned, and those who follow him like Abdullah Sa'id. My attempt to look at the Quran the Quranic theme of justice as a whole and look at the blueprint and principles of justice in the Quran, hopefully will be of benefit in the field, and maybe will be something that other people could take in different a different direction. And you also have figures such as Taha Abdurrahman, the Moroccan philosopher, who, although not writing in Quranic studies, has a keen appreciation of the importance of the Quran and ethical concepts in his own understanding of a distinctive modern Islamic philosophy. So in conclusion, the field of Quranic studies is enjoying a period of growth. There are regular major conferences, one in SOAS every 2 years, also the regular conferences of IQSA, the International Quranic Studies Association, based more in America, but with an international conference, regular conference. And students are increasingly choosing to do their PhD in Quranic studies and to study the Quran in their undergraduate and graduate courses. Many more of the lecturers, publishing researchers and students are Muslim than ever before. And it's regular now in conferences that most of the audience, many of the presenters, or even most of the presenters are now Muslims working in academic Quranic studies. It's really a shift from a perception of a Western academic Quranic studies that is dominated by non-Muslims. It's really not the case. The non-Muslims are increasingly the exception in many of the public events and even in the student body of universities, in the university classroom, and of course the Muslim colleges. This varied field has led some to feel that the old order has gone and has been replaced by chaos, as I said, that the field is in disarray. But from a different perspective, this vibrancy is a sign that the field is in good health and good order. It has become closer to, as I mentioned, MacIntyre's ideal, in which different traditions can extend their own preferred formulations with like-minded colleagues and also test them against colleagues with radically different views. I remember a young Muslim coming up to me once at a mosque while I was while in the stage of doing my PhD, and he said, "You're doing your PhD on the Quran. What could you find to say new?" I answered, "What book could I have more to say something about?" Scholars on every side of the confessional and methodological divide can agree today that the Quran is a text worthy of continued research and study. Thank you for your attention.